Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
the world that awaits,
gifts that are yours to explore,
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.
Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoogstra. Does the suburbs mean only SUVs, big homes, manicured yards? When we live in the suburbs, do we insulate ourselves from what the world needs, what our city may need? Well, our guest today is going to talk about having soul and living in the suburbs. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Dave Goetz, author of Death by Suburb, How to Keep the Suburbs from Killing Your Soul. And he owns a marketing firm in the suburbs of Wheaton, Illinois, and defines himself as a quintessential suburbanite. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Really liked the book. Really liked the book because it was funny and deep and challenging all at the same time. And you talk about a concept in this book about the thicker life. Now, none of us want thicker middles, but we want
exactly.
But we don't want a slim life, and we don't want a shallow life. So, what do you talk about when you say thicker life?
What we talk about in the book is throughout the last 2,000 years, Christians have been trying to figure out what does it mean to live in various cultures across the world.
Right.
Miroslav Volf, who wrote the book Exclusion and Embrace, has a great first chapter in the book, which he calls Distance and Belonging. And he says we need to live in that tension between distance from the culture that we live in.
Right, so this idea of critical distance, you don't just soak it all up.
Exactly.
You have some opinions about it.
Right, and you have, there's a sense in which you're separate from the culture.
Right.
But yet you belong into the culture.
Right.
And one of the things he talks about is this idea of, in the Old Testament, Abraham physically left Ur.
Right.
But in the New Testament, Paul says the leaving really is an internal leaving. So, throughout history, we've trying to figure this out.
That's right.
So this book is trying to figure that out. So the thicker life, I think, is people who are trying to figure that out. And so if you're living this one-dimensional career, big house, and you have this unreflective pursuit, you're living the flatter life as opposed to the thicker life. And the thicker life is a life that is really sees God in all parts of life.
It's a reflective life, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's a reflective life.
It's not just an automatic pilot life.
Absolutely.
Right, so you have to be aware of your surroundings, and like this idea of being a little bit distant, you have to be maybe able to say that's not so good.
Absolutely.
And not remove yourself. So it's not, that's not so good, I'm going to remove myself. It's, I'm going to stay engaged, but I'm going to still have a critical look. Not critical as like it's just all bad, but a thoughtful
look. I like your word reflective, where you're able to step back and say, why am I doing this?
Right.
Why am I caught up in this, and why does my life look the same as others?
And so does the suburbs make that reflective life harder? I
think so, and I think those of us of faith, there's a sense in which there's this split in our consciousness between the church on Sunday morning, say, and the rest of our life.
Right.
And we drive up in the church on our big SUV, we drive past some poor people that we didn't notice because they're in the suburbs, and poor tend to be secreted away in the suburbs. But there's this whole existence that can happen in which there's this split between the good life that we live and the lives of others around us. And
the suburbs can make things look very tidy.
Absolutely.
Very neat, and the problems are controllable.
Absolutely, right. Make sure your garbage out, by 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning with the proper colored tags.
We got schedules.
Absolutely.
And we meet them.
And I'm not opposed to that.
Right.
So
but
the alternative is not great either. So.
But what you're saying is, okay, knowing that, what do you have to do in the regular routine of your life to help you maintain your soul, that reflective part of you, so that it doesn't seem plastic?
Well, the thesis of the book is, one, you need to stay in the suburbs as opposed to leave the suburbs.
Yeah, okay, because that's, am I more Christian if I go and live in the city?
Right.
Am I?
And that's the thinking, and absolutely not.
Right.
that would mean that only a few people can do that.
Right.
Just like it would to say that you have to move out to the rural to live a fully embodied life. That's a little bit silly.
Right.
That means only those in power, those who have money
Right.
and means, are able to do that. What makes a book unique, in terms, you call me a quintessential suburbanite. I grew up in a very rural communities
That's right.
in North
I read
Dakota.
that in the book, right.
My high school class was 17.
Now, that's not very large.
No, and I
No.
think they kicked out one of the students, so it actually was 16 by
And
the time it
graduation.
actually walked down the line, right? So there is when I moved to the suburbs, I really didn't move to the suburbs until I was 28 or 29, and that's when I moved to the Chicagoland area. Now, I had lived obviously in the suburbs. I'd gone to college, university, I'd gone to Denver Seminary for a Master of Divinity degree, and I was working actually in a church in one of the outer perimeter suburbs of Denver. So, but not until I got married, moved to the Chicagoland area, kind of had that first professional job in writing and editing, and began to have my daughters, take my daughter to school, my son to school. In fact, there's a great defining moment in the book when I was reading with the kindergarten class, and I was volunteering like a good father.
Yeah.
And one of the things you do is you pull out your daughter or son, you read with them, and then they get a new book if they've mastered that. But you're reading with all the kids. But of course, I pulled my daughter out first.
Sure.
And I remember how emotionally smug I felt.
You're so good.
Oh, I was just thinking, she is amazing.
Right.
And I was feeling so good. The very next boy, I don't remember what his name was, the very next boy was reading at a 4th grade level. And I was undone. I remember the anxiety I felt.
Right.
And that was at that moment that I realized learning isn't about learning in the suburbs. Learning is about winning.
Yes, you make this point. It's almost an arms race.
Absolutely.
Is your child involved in how many sports and how well does he or she do?
Absolutely.
And then what about the ballet lessons? And then what about the other extracurricular things? And then honors, student, the bumper sticker. All of that is, and then the car you drive.
Absolutely.
The arms race of looking successful and without any weaknesses or blemishes.
Right, absolutely. Let me juxtapose 2 conversations I had within the last 2 weeks.
All right.
One was at a party, just a fun party that I was at the other night, and I overheard one of the fathers talking about his talented and gifted son.
Right.
His talented and gifted son is maybe 7 or 8. And he was just going off on how the educational system in the school is all for those middle-of-the-road kids.
Right.
And his kids are so bright.
Right. And they're not getting their resources.
And not getting the resources.
Right.
When you actually talk to teachers, it's the talented and gifted kids that really get the resources, and those often, at least in our school district with the special needs, it's often those in the middle that are kind of just left to, muddle along.
Right.
And then 2 days later, I was in a small group with a group of parents with special needs kids. We hosted it at our home. Mm-hmm. And I came away from that meeting that night talking about the angst and the struggle they're going through, just crushed. But the issues couldn't be more different. And as I left, I realized, or actually I went to bed, God is most at work in those families with special needs kids because there's the pain, there's the suffering, and they're wrestling with the deep issues of God. To me, that's the thicker life.
Right. And so we should not run away. You make the point. Don't run away from the suffering that happens to you, because it's a gateway to getting this thicker life. And that if we continue to say, I'm going to make everything nice and controlled and perfect, we are going to shortchange the quality that we can have on earth for as long as we have it here.
Absolutely.
And those you tell about the story of a couple who take in a son, take in a person who's a friend of their son, and all of a sudden they become parents again. And that experience helps them to have a thicker life. And it wasn't, let's sit down and calculate whether this is a good idea.
Right.
Weigh the costs.
Right.
Right?
It was an opportunity that was there in the moment.
Right.
He was there at a baseball game.
Yes.
And he didn't know where his mom was at the time. They didn't know actually what was going on, so he stayed the night. Next thing you know, literally, I think this year he's graduating from high school. And
with this family.
With this family.
Right. And they had to decide that mom was still kind of in the picture. They had some contact back and forth, but they just decided that they were going to give a particular kind of opportunity experience to this son. And they say he's like a son.
Absolutely.
To us.
Absolutely.
Right, with all of the things. Now, how do we recognize those opportunities?
The only way that I can see that this happens in your life is that you cannot, one of the deep themes of the book is that you cannot attack the deeper life directly.
I'm going to now go on my retreat.
I'm on the deeper life.
Yeah, and I'm gonna earn it. I'm gonna will it.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna schedule it.
I'm deep, aren't you?
Yeah, right. And
I
how
mean,
do I
I'm
prove
so
that?
deep. I am so deep.
I know, but I'm maybe deeper, right? But so what have you done to get deep? You say that can't happen.
No, I think you try to pursue it directly, and I think
You can't try to pursue
you can't pursue
right.
it directly. And I think throughout history, the spiritual masters is in Christian history, both in the Orthodox tradition, Protestant tradition, Catholic tradition, all say the same things when you start to read the people who really have written the deeper works on spirituality. And they say that you can't attack the thicker life directly. And so what you do is you create these disciplines in your life to open yourself up to God. And so when you talk about the thicker life being more reflective, you do the discipline because that begins to force you. For example, the discipline of solitude begins to force you to start to think about your life. And often it's what bubbles to the surface in those moments is not great deep feelings of ecstasy of God. There's a lot of darkness there.
But the busyness keeps us
Absolutely.
from having to look at that too carefully.
Absolutely.
And that's that suburban, why you named this Death by Suburb, as I was reading the book, is because the suburbs allow us to escape because we've got so many options, so many possibilities, so many things to do. So when you have to sit and reflect and have maybe hours of quiet where things start to bubble up that you've been able to push down, you have to look at them.
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you one right now in my life, and I'm not too happy about it, but one of the I think things that happens to men in midlife, especially someone like me, I've started a business during the most difficult time, and I've survived. I'm not sitting here saying that we're ever going to be a Fortune 2000 company, but I've survived. And there's a sense of power that you have when you achieve things, especially for men. And one of the issues is when you acquire power is there's a sense in which God asks you to come and die, to come it up. And here's how you see that, to give it up. You see this in church, where you want to be, as a man, you want to be noticed, you want to be asked on the boards, you want to be asked your opinion, in your marriage, the whole thing. And so there's this sense in which you think that the way to the top is kind of the way you've already climbed, and that's not true. The person who's actually influenced me the most in this whole book as I was reading was Richard Rohr, the Catholic writer, who has this audio cassette series called Men and Women, The Journey of Spiritual Transformation. Rohr is much better live than he is in his books, but it's electric. And he talks about the first half of life versus the second half of life. The first half of life, even in our spirituality in our churches, is all about trying harder. The second half of life for men, he says, is different for women. He said, as the archetype for men need to learn the way of descent.
So giving it away, giving the power away,
up,
giving the mentoring away, giving your experiences away, in a way to perhaps bring along someone else. But it's not this ascension.
Absolutely. And what's really hard for a guy is when you're not invited in. And yet you have the expertise, and yet you're not invited into that.
But this is all about identity.
Absolutely, it is.
So where does your identity lie? Does your identity lie as a child of God, fully loved exactly as you are? It's the exactly as you are part that for the Christian is so impossible to really believe.
Absolutely.
It's like, no, really God loves me better because, He's got to love me more.
Absolutely.
At least I'm worthy because I'm doing all this good stuff and I'm achieving. I may even be doing philanthropic and I'm serving my church. I'm doing so many good things. He must love me more. And then he says, I don't.
Absolutely.
I love you right now the same way, 100%. And the spiritual disciplines help us get back to what is a very vulnerable and humble place to be.
It is.
Right?
The alternative, Rohr says, is taking the embittered journey.
What's the embittered journey?
The embittered journey is someone who tends to want to acquire power throughout life. Let me give you a good example. It would be, let's say, a 55 to 60-year-old man who's still competing with young men.
Right.
You see it in church board meetings. You see it in church congregational meetings. you see it. I once was on a plane, and there's a man, and very clearly his second wife or third wife, and he was in first class, and for some reason I was there too. I don't think I earned it. I think I had like upgraded or something free.
Yeah, right.
And but he was, the whole time he was loud, obnoxious, talking about his boats, that's an egregious example.
Right.
But it's a good example of a man who's never learned to descend. And Rohr says, if you want to be the sweet grandfather,
Right.
if you want to be people who want to be around you, one of the persons who has mentored me is now like 91, 92. He doesn't really know he's mentored me, but he now is on dialysis and has only like 1 or 2 good hours a day. And once a week, he has like 10 or 15 guys that meet with him. Wow. And here's a guy, and nobody's requiring these men to be with him.
Right. And so why do they want to be with him?
Because he has learned the art of descent, and he's there listening and giving, and he almost holds court in some sense.
So he's willing to have these men come around him all together when he is in this, kind of a debilitated state,
very debilitated state, absolutely.
And what do you glean from this willingness to be in debilitated state? What?
Well, you realize that the way to the top in the second half of life is not the way it was in the first half of life. The game changes.
What it does is it gives us permission to be ourselves.
Absolutely.
See, it's this,
absolutely.
If you're with everybody else who's striving, then you're on the little gerbil wheel.
Absolutely.
And whether you're with someone who says, no, I am who I am, and I am content, I'm peaceful about it, and I invite you to be who you are. Be exactly who you are, as flawed as you are. See, that's real, that's reality. It's the real life piece.
Yeah, that is powerful.
It is very, very powerful.
The other night when my wife and I had these families in our home, it was really clear each of them had a special needs child. Mm-hmm. And it was really clear spiritually who had moved to this letting go phase and who hadn't.
Right.
And so there were people who had just discovered their son has autism or Asperger's. There's those who had much more severe. But one was amount of time. There was, and you could really see people who are still struggling, just wrestling with the fix.
Right.
And then you realize the people who are not at peace, because that would be too flippant.
Right.
But they're at a different place. They come to this point where there's things you can't fix. And once you come to that unfixable point, then all of a sudden you're opened up to all these good things in your life. Right. There's this, in a sense, all the spiritual masters talk about the letting go. For them, it's the letting go of some magic bullet that's going to turn autism into maybe just a severe allergy reaction to something.
Right. Well, and this is sort of the place that you hope you can find yourself in by living a thicker life, by being aware of your surroundings, and then by saying, I'm going to give it over.
Absolutely.
And the scriptures are right. When I give it up, I have life.
Absolutely.
Right? But that life, if we identify with Jesus Christ, is a life of suffering. It's not an elimination of that. Yeah. And therefore, but boy, I think you say in the book, that the thing not to say is, oh, hey, this suffering's good for you.
Right.
This is going to really give you the best kind of life because you get the opportunity to suffer.
The other thing is not to say is that now you need to go look for it. That's the thicker life. I don't think that's a thicker life. I mean, who wants that? I just think that if you're a human being, that's one of the journeys. At the end, life ends badly for all of us. Right.
In the sense that we're no longer here, but the better part, though,
physically, exactly. And so that's the suffering part. So we learn this deeper life because we know that when we leave this earth, we want to be just a half step away from eternity, not, having to try to figure out between here and there.
We talk. Part of this is not.
That's a
living,
metaphor. Yeah. That's not a theological statement. Right. Exactly.
This idea of lack of fear. Part of living this thicker life, or living a life that has contentedness or peacefulness in it, is that you are no longer as afraid as you were before. And this striving for control or getting it right or having the best is because we are afraid of what would happen if we just trusted God to just do what was in our life plan. What is it that we are going to learn? And sort of the falling back into His arms about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You talk a little bit in the book about how we, as consumers, let's just go to the church. The church sometimes helps, but sometimes doesn't help in this sort of hope for a reflective life. What's this, this idea of church hopping or, consumerism in church?
Well, I think one of my assumptions in the book is that often the church contributes to the busyness,
right,
because it's very programmatic driven, and in
right,
the suburbs especially, it's really modeled after the Park District. And I say in the book that it's a little bit like when your son is on the swim team, as a parent, you're required to volunteer.
Right, right.
And you're volunteering, but you're required.
Right.
3 swim meets before the conference meet, plus you have to do the conference meet.
Right.
It's a little bit like that for church. You have kids and you start to attend a church. Well, next thing you know, you're being asked to help out with this and that, and there's a sense of obligation to do
right,
that.
Because it's the whole, you're trying to get this volunteer organization
absolutely,
going well too.
Absolutely.
Everybody plays their part.
So I think many of the suburban churches, and I don't say this negatively because I think there's a lot of positive, but are really built around the first half of life spirituality. Energy, enthusiasm, youth,
right,
kind of the classic Urbana approach to spirituality, which is
involved.
Great. Get people involved, get them enthused, get them to save the world, which is all. These are all good things. Don't hear me saying that that's negative.
Right.
But I think what that does is that all these things glom onto your life, and then they become just one more busy thing, and they don't become the activity that's supposed to actually open us up to God. They become a way that prevents us from getting to God. In fact, Janet and I are just saying, we're not going to be part of a small group. I know that sounds like a radical thing to say, but there's a big push right now in our church to do that. But one, we have a ton of friends, and the function of small groups is to build community. We have tons of community.
Right.
But we're at a different phase right now. So there is a phase in life in which you should be a part of that, perhaps. But we're at a different phase. We're trying to strip back our activities so that we can actually serve in social justice areas, and that we can do more pure service as opposed to just serve on committees and attend things.
Okay, but now if everybody decided to do that, or do you help people say what's your phase in life? But if everybody said, you know what, I'm simplifying, right? Then what happens to, these organized functions that serve a function for some and not for all? How does the Christian community organize itself?
Right, absolutely. Well, I don't think organization's bad. I do think that we have to be really aware of parents in their 30s, late 20s and 30s. We were a little bit older when we had children. My wife was 39 when she had our last child.
Okay.
So, but what we do is we create a spirituality around their kids, and the parents participate in it. So, to say we're going to strip back is often a way out of actually participating in the life of God, because it makes it because it sounds good, right? It's like, dude, who doesn't want to strip back?
Simplify your life.
Yeah, it's like, I'm into that.
Right, it's all about simplifying.
Right, exactly. So,
but then who picks up the leadership
absolutely.
pieces?
Well, I'll tell you who does it. It's the people who are in their 50s and 60s who are teaching Sunday school classes.
Right. Okay, but this takes an intentional knowing of your congregation. It's not, okay, who's on the list, we got to call.
Right.
Oh, well, they're willing.
Right.
Now, maybe they're willing, and maybe that's a bad thing.
Right,
Maybe
exactly.
the person should say, boy, we better not ask that person again, because we are just glomming up their life, and even though they're willing because they're a good soul, that's not a good idea.
I would say to churches that there is a really important piece today.
What's that?
I would encourage churches to just strategically to look at their entire program structure and say, how can we simplify and ask really the hard questions? Is this really helping people move them to Jesus and move them into the deeper life, or is it necessary? And I think,
well, you might say, we don't have a congregation right now that should take on all of these other things, because that's just not where we're at. But that takes a very reflective group.
It does. It takes strong leadership.
Right.
Men and women, it does.
So why is sticking with a church, whether it's a simplified church or a busy church, part of being a spiritual discipline?
Well, I think because it cuts against this natural tendency for us to cut and run when we're unhappy. All the school teachers know that their parents parachute in when you've got a 4th grader and they're unhappy with their teacher. They want a different teacher. They're going to quit the soccer team because they're not playing their son. There's always this ultimate threat of leaving. And in church, there's no social constraints to keep people at churches, absolutely none. And so the discipline really is a discipline to say, when I'm upset with this church, when I'm frustrated with the leadership, when I think it's going in a direction, maybe I need to stay.
Right.
And not try to power up and either try to control it, but actually stay and serve. I'm telling you that because I'm in the throes of that.
Right. Well, you know what? This is, though, how you get through the harder questions, because you got to look at yourself. What am I contributing?
Right. Absolutely.
Right. And then
Absolutely.
you have to say, why is it not working so well? Right.
Right.
So it's not. It's like the suffering piece on a different kind of
Totally
definition.
different. Right. Absolutely.
Right. Because we want it to be good and happy.
It's a nice connection.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks so much. My guest today has been Dave Goetz, author of Death by Suburb: How to Keep the Suburbs from Killing Your Soul. And I'm Shirley Hoogstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.
Funding for Inner Compass is provided by Calvin College.
The life that's unfolding,
The world that awaits.
Gifts that are yours to explore.
and God's to use.
It's all happening here at Calvin.